Hi all, today we'll discuss about top GraphQL with Spring Boot real-time interview questions. So these all are the questions interviewer will ask for the GraphQL with a Spring Boot related interview question. So the first question is what is GraphQL and how does it differ from REST? So we have a multiple space to call either GraphQL and then REST and others also. So mainly they will ask what is the difference between GraphQL and how does it differ from the REST. So the GraphQL is a query language for API and a runtime for executing those query by using a type system you define for the data. So unlike the REST where multiple endpoint return fixed data accesses will be there. GraphQL allow client to request exactly the data they need. This reduces the number of requests and overfetching of and underfetching data. So this is the main difference of the GraphQL and REST. Depends on the requirement, we will go for the GraphQL and REST. So GraphQL is a query language for API at runtime executing, and REST will have a multiple endpoint which have to call. The second question is how does define a GraphQL schema in a Spring Boot? So if you want to define GraphQL schema in a Spring Boot, so we have a .graphqls files will be there. So this file contain type definitions, query, mutations, subscriptions. So this schema is typically placed in the src main resource directory. The second question is what is resolver in GraphQL? So resolver is a function that resolve a value for a type or field in a schema. So in a Spring Boot, resolver can be created by implementing the GraphQL resolver interface or using @GraphQL annotations, resolver annotations. So this is the third questions coming for intermediate type of questions. So the fourth one is how do you handle authentication and authorization in GraphQL Spring Boot? So authentications can be handled by securing the GraphQL endpoint using a Spring security, and authorization can be managed within resolver by checking users role or permissions before accessing or processing the query or mutation. So JWT token or OAuth can be used for securing authentication. So these two ways we have authentication and authorizations. Based on that, we will handle the GraphQL with the Spring Boot. Coming for the next fifth question, explain explain the difference between query, mutations, and subscription in GraphQL. So the query is used to fetch the data, mutation is used to modify the data like create, update, and delete, and subscription is used for the real-time update. So these three differences there: query to fetch the data, mutations to modify the data, and a subscription will fetch the real-time data updates. Now coming for the next, how can you handle exception in GraphQL with a Spring Boot? So if you want to handle exception, implement GraphQL handler will be there. So GraphQL exception handler is there. By using that, we can handle the exception in GraphQL with a Spring Boot. Or else we have a annotation also there at the rate exception handler annotations in a Spring Boot is a custom exception class can be created to handle the specific error case. Now we will discuss about advanced level interview question. So how do you optimize performance in a GraphQL API? So performance can be optimized by batching and caching request. So using data loader for the batch loading of data, avoiding n plus one query problem, and optimizing data query. So through that we will optimize the performance. So avoiding n plus one query and optimizing database query. Coming for the next, what is n plus one problem in GraphQL and how does we solve this in a Spring Boot? So n plus one problems occurs when query trigger multiple database requests for related data. It it can be solved using tools like data loaders to batch or cache request, reducing number of data query and all, database query. And all. So these all are the things. Coming for the next, explain how to use GraphQL subscription in a Spring Boot. So subscription is a GraphQL allow client to receive a real-time updates. In a Spring Boot, subscription can be implemented using WebSocket or server sent event SSC. We can say SSC server sent event, or the at the rate subscription mapping annotations can be used to define the subscription resolver. Now coming for the practical questions, so these all are the practical questions which interviewer will ask, like how do you implement pagination in GraphQL API with Spring Boot? So pagination can be implemented using cursor based or offset based pagination. In a Spring Boot, you can see you can use argument in GraphQL query to specify the limit and offset. Use a Spring Data JPA or custom query to fetch the paginations. So mostly we'll use this custom data JPA or custom query for that. Coming for this next, can you explain real-time use case where GraphQL is more beneficial than REST in Spring Boot applications? One case is a dashboard application where users need real-time data updates and custom data fetching. So GraphQL allow client request exactly the data they need and subscribe to update, reduce the amount of data transfer and improving the performance. So mostly we will create a while dashboard application where we have to fetch the real time data. In that cases mostly GraphQL will be better than REST. Coming for the next, how do you integrate GraphQL in a Spring Boot application? So GraphQL can be integrated into the Spring Boot applications by adding GraphQL Spring Boot starter dependency in pom.xml and define the schema like .graphql file, creating resolver class and configuring the GraphQL endpoint. So these all are the way. So this is the simple code snip. Provide a sample code snipped examples where we can have a GraphQL query resolver in Spring Boot. So this is the simple .java. So in that Java we have a class. The class is a query which implement query GraphQL resolvers, and at the rate component annotations there we have a multiples uh, variables methods and all. So private final book repository, and then we have a query this queries. And so this is the just a overview like how we will create a GraphQL query resolver in a Spring. So some example in GraphQL mutation resolver. So one is the query resolver here, this one, and this is a mutation resolver. So how we will create a mutation? Create a class in mutation. In that we implement the GraphQL mutation resolver at the rate component annotations on the class level. Then we have to create the mutations here. So create a mutations methods, and then we will use that. Now coming for the next best practice related interview questions, like what are the some practice for designing a GraphQL API with a Spring Boot? So there are like define clear and concise schema, use paginations for large data set, implement proper error handling and validations, secure the API for authentication and authorization, optimize the resolver to avoid n+1 problem, use tools like data loaders for the efficient data fetchings and all. So these all are the best practice where we will design a GraphQL API with a Spring Boot integrations. So interviewer will ask this type of questions. So these all are the common interview questions related for GraphQL with a Spring Boot. Yeah, thank you.